The first thing I want you to do is forget the map you learned in school for a moment. Forget tidy county lines and neat timelines. Imagine instead a place where the ordinary geographies, the river bends, the coastal ledges, the dark teeth of the swamp, keep small, stubborn things that refuse to be explained. In Massachusetts, those things sit like puzzle pieces found under the floorboards of history, a boulder carved with marks that scholars and charlatans have argued over for centuries. A vast swamp whose Algonquian name still smells of warning and reverence. Stone chambers and peculiar tracks in the sand that don't line up with our tidy story of how people moved and traded in pre-colonial New England. The expectation is simple: modern archaeology, carbon clocks, and chemists with microscopes will close these books. But then you walk to the river at low tide and see a rock whose grooves refuse to obey any single language. You stand on the lip of a swamp at dawn and hear the world hold its breath. Or you trace a string of artifacts that hint at trade routes strangers never expected. Science has given us tools: radiocarbon dates, isotopes, stratigraphy, and yet, even with those tools, some places keep their silence. That's what this is about: the stubborn, beautiful places where evidence gathers like dew and the questions hang longer than the answers. I promise you this: by the time we're finished, you'll have met stones that look like signposts to ancient mariners, footprints in chambers that make us rethink who moved across these coasts, and swampwind stories where the line between history and legend blurs in the peat. Along the way, we'll be honest about the limits of the evidence. We will follow cool-headed hypotheses and warmer, mythic ones. We'll hold trade beads and clay sherds in our mind, and then imagine giants and voyagers and lost tribes. You'll be invited to picture, not just to read. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn. Picture the river shining low, and the carved lines whispering salt and time. We will move between measured facts, dates, cultures, artifacts, and the human impulse to narrate the unexplainable. That tension is the engine of this whole story. This is not history as a list of winners and losers. It's an interrogation of evidence and imagination, and it's built for listeners, for you who like to hear a scene shaped so clearly you can almost smell the mud. Sometimes the smallest fragment appends a neat assumption. A shard of pottery will place a ship farther west than anyone expected. A petroglyph will stubbornly refuse to be categorized. A mound or a chamber will invite as many questions as the carbon samples give answers. So let's begin not with an answer but with a small, patient thing that sits half hidden at the lip of a river, a kind of stone manuscript that has been debated for centuries, and still speaks as if it has a private joke the scholars have yet to get. The boulder rises from the river like an old sentinel, broad-faced and patient, carved where tide and current could have made it visible to any boat approaching from the bay. By the time European settlers began to write about it in the 17th century, they treated it as a riddle and a relic. The stone's surface is carved with what look like pictographs, triangles, human silhouettes, geometric swirls, and linear marks that refuse clear translation. You can stand before it and feel how small you are, how recent our certainty is, how much the river knows about movement that predates our maps. Scholars have proposed everything from indigenous petroglyphs to Phoenician or Norse scripts, and across 3 centuries interpretations have ranged from careful linguistic study to wild speculation. The boulder is older than many of the interpretive frames applied to it. The debate has become its own kind of history, an archaeology of opinion. That stone, known today in museum cases and guidebooks as Dighton Rock, weighs an estimated 40 tons and has a face more than 10 feet long, a weathered surface etched with designs that have been studied and copied since at least the late 1600s. Early colonial writers and visiting antiquarians measured it and made drawings. The earliest verifiable written reference appears in the late 17th century. Those early accounts recorded some of the very same grooves and figures that still puzzle us today. Over the centuries, people have moved the stone, recorded tracings, and argued in learned journals and taverns alike about whether the marks are indigenous pictographs, medieval Norse runes, Phoenician graffiti, 17th century sailors' marks, or the accidental scarping of river ice and rock. What's remarkable is not only that the marks are ambiguous, but that the stones sat in estuarine tidewater for so long, being submerged and revealed, long enough to collect histories like barnacles. The physical facts, the stone's weight, its dimensions, The ways weather and tide have altered its face, our data. And yet the carved shapes resist being slotted neatly into a single, human story. Now, let's be fair, some of the grander claims are built on wishful reading. In the 19th and early 20th centuries in particular, the lure of proving Old World visitors to the New World before Columbus led earnest men to see alphabets where simple motifs might be. That sense of discovery. If only these marks are Phoenician or Norse, then the whole story of contact must be rewritten, is a powerful narrative motor. But we should also be fair to the rock itself. There are elements of the carving that fit very well with known indigenous schematic traditions, human figures with raised arms, quadrupeds, certain curving motifs, and there are elements that stubbornly refuse that simple match. The truth here is messy. Some portions of the stone could well be indigenous carvings that date pre-contact. Others might be later incisions. Still others might be natural grooves emphasized by human hands. The rock may be a palimpsest, many hands across many times leaving marks on one shared object. That idea is actually more interesting than any single triumphant claim. It means a single artifact can record multiple layers of human presence. Picture yourself walking the low riverbank at dawn, the air salted and faintly sweet, the fog hanging like gauze in the mouth of the Taunton River. You step out onto a mudflat exposed by the tide and see the rock, a slanted, six-sided block poking out of the silt. If you were a mariner centuries ago, you might see the carvings as a message to the next traveler. If you were a member of a local indigenous community, you might see a remembered map, a ritual surface, or the slow erosion of stories. Step closer and the lines aren't a code so much as a conversation. Now here's where it gets tricky. The conversation is multilingual across time. Attempts to transcribe the marks have produced conflicting charts because the stone itself is not a text in our sense. It is an object that has been used and reused. What we do know, and this is important, is that serious scholars have published competing analyses and that none resolves every doubt. The stone has been traced, cast, photographed, and finally moved to a museum, but its voice has not become any clearer. Let's roll back and put some dates and cultures on the table, in part so you understand the scale and in part so we can see where mysteries grow. The region's human story stretches back thousands of years. The earliest peoples we name in New England, Paleo-Indians, were here more than 10,000 years before any European set foot on these shores, hunting megafauna in a dramatically different climatic world. They were followed in time by groups archaeologists class as archaic, roughly 8,000 to 3,000 years before present, who developed regional economies and technologies, and then by woodland populations, from roughly 3,000 to 400 years ago, who left ceramics, structured villages, and long-distance trade networks. By the time Europeans arrived, the coastal and riverine peoples we call the Wampanoag and related Algonquian speakers had their own long, detailed histories with seasonal movements, sacred places, and maritime routes. An inscribed boulder at a river mouth could mean many things in that long sweep of time: a territorial marker, a sacred canvas, navigational signage, or even a record of events. But because this boulder can also be read, with some willful interpretation, as something else, a foreign script, for instance, it becomes contested ground between evidence and imagination. There are multiple competing theories about Dighton Rock, and each helps us see a different truth about how people in the past and present make meaning. One careful, scholarly theory posits that most of the deeper, less ambiguous grooves are indigenous petroglyphs carved centuries before European contact, perhaps as early as the Woodland period. In that view, the surfaces were used for ritual or mnemonic purposes and then later reworked by other hands. A second theory suggests that some marks were added by later European sailors, perhaps 17th or 18th century mariners leaving symbols, initials, or graffiti, which would make the stone a layered historical record. A third, more controversial set of theories proposes transatlantic contact, Norse, Phoenician, or other Old World visitors leaving writing. Those claims often rely on comparing the grooves to known alphabets, but they usually ignore the messy palimpsest quality and the archaeological context that favors multiple, overlapping explanations. Still, for all the evidence, the rock refuses a single final reading. We still don't know which marks are the oldest, who made them, or what many of them intended to say. It's tempting to end there, to call the rock a closed case and move on, but that would be cheating the true nature of the mystery. When archaeologists and linguists examine Dighton Rock, they do what scientists always do: measure, compare, cross-date, and test hypotheses against the sedimentary and documentary record. When antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries drew elaborate runes on paper and trumpeted pre-Columbian voyagers, they were often mixing early romanticism with incomplete evidence. Modern researchers are more cautious, and that caution is a kind of reverence. Acknowledging uncertainty is precisely our better way of honoring the past. Now, let's be fair. Some modern enthusiasts will point to one tracing or another and say, "There! That's proof." But to accept that, you must simultaneously ignore weathering patterns, riverine movement, and the simple fact that rocks register both human and natural marks over time. The seductive thing about singular proof is how tidy it makes the story, but nature and history are rarely tidy. There is a mythic layer too, and myths deserve listening to not because they're literally true but because they tell us what people wanted to make of the unknown. Around Dighton Rock swirl tales of giant figures, of a hidden message left by ancient sea voyagers warning of something, and of spirits that marked and remarked the stone. Those myths are often dismissed by the Academy, yet they are cultural evidence in their own right. Stories about giants, lost voyagers, or curses reveal how communities absorb rare objects into moral and cosmological narratives. We should respect the mythic content without treating it as a stand-alone historical thesis. Picture, if you will, a local elder telling a child about the rock while the river laps its edges. The story will not be a laboratory report, but it will be precise in a different way, precise about what the rock means for belonging, danger, and memory. So what does Dighton Rock ultimately teach us? It teaches us humility. We can calibrate our instruments and refine radiometric dates, but the rock reminds us that human presence is layered and that single artifacts often carry multiple histories. Sometimes the best scholarship is not a loud proclamation but a patient syntax of questions. Who first put a tool to the stone? What was the relationship between coastal and inland peoples then? Did the river's changing channels reveal or conceal different parts of the rock at different times, inviting successive waves of interaction? Still, for all the evidence, the rock continues to hold open a space for wonder, a place where science and myth meet and neither gets to hog the whole story. Now imagine leaving that river, the tide hissing back out, and walking inland toward a place whose name in the elder tongues murmurs of spirits, a vast swamp where history and legend braid until you can hardly pull them apart. In the language of the local Algonquian speakers, the place is called Hockomock, a name often translated as place where spirits dwell. It is part of a larger field of uncanny reports that locals have labeled, with a touch of showman flair, the Bridgewater Triangle, an area of southeastern Massachusetts that holds Hockomock at its southern heart. The swamp itself is the largest freshwater wetland in the state, and was a strategic landscape in King Philip's War. It offered concealment and a tactical base for Indigenous resistance in the 1670s. It also preserves, under peat and muck, human traces, burial mounds, and the debris of long habitations. Its human history is incontrovertible and long. Its reputation as a locus of unusual phenomena is younger and more contested. What's important here is how the swamp stands at the intersection of environmental continuity, human memory, and the yearning for explanation when things can't be neatly measured. But here's where it gets tricky. The Bridgewater Triangle is a modern label and a modern narrative frame. In the 1970s and 1980s, writers and local historians collected reports of strange lights, sightings of odd creatures, and inexplicable events across this roughly 30-square-mile area. The stories range from plausible, unexplained lights caused by swamp gases or reflections, to the extraordinary, orbs, Bigfoot-type creatures, and accounts of people getting lost in the mire and not returning the same. Science leans toward geophysical and psychological explanations, bog methane, optical illusions, suggestibility, while folklore and popular accounts offer a thicker, animistic reading. The place has agency, or is watched by ancient powers. Still, for all the evidence we can bring to bear, maps, aerial imagery, soil cores, the swamp resists full domestication by science. It keeps unmeasured spaces, an important point to remember when we claim total explanation for places that are ecologically and culturally dense. We will return to this wet, muffled landscape later, because it ties into broader questions of how sacred places are preserved in the landscape and how colonial disruption can fragment or cloak older practices. For now, hold the image, mist on black water, cattails shivering, a world that remembers differently than our taxonomies do. We'll pull artifacts and documents into a frame that tries to balance evidence with the human need to tell and retell compelling stories. When the swamp gives up data, a charcoal lens, a piece of pottery, a pollen core, science works with modest triumphs. But when it gives up stories, the older, slower cultural texts are sometimes the most revealing documents of all. This is our method for the rest of the trip. Meet the stubborn thing, place it in context with dates and cultures, weigh competing theories, and then, because we are human and because mystery without imagination is a different kind of poverty, give the place its mythic breath. Picture yourself with me now at the river, the boulder at your feet, the swamp a low sound behind you. Hold those images. We'll come back to them. And we'll go to other sites too, places that challenge our maps and our certainties, and where the evidence makes us smarter for admitting what we don't yet know. The swamp takes its time. Walk toward it, and you will notice how the air changes. The world seems softened at the edges, as if the swamp itself eats sharpness and keeps only what is slow and patient. The place called Hockomock, often translated from the local Algonquian as place where spirits dwell, is not a neat attraction on a tourist map. It is nearly 17,000 acres of peat, alder, and black water that holds a different tempo of history. For thousands of years the landscape now named Hockomock was part of a seasonal circuit of life for Algonquian-speaking peoples, fishing, harvesting, moving with the light and flood. Its peat beds and drowning logs preserve pollen, seeds, charcoal, and sometimes the bones of animals and people. Each layer in a core is a kind of slow diary. That ecological depth is why the swamp is archaeologically important. It traps and keeps traces that elsewhere would rot away, and it's why the place also reads like a repository of stories. In modern imagination, that swamp is at the gritty heart of what locals call the Bridgewater Triangle, a roughly 200 square mile area of southeastern Massachusetts catalogued from the 1970s onward by Ryder researchers for its cluster of unexplained phenomena, strange lights, disappearing hikers, reports of large, bipedal animals, and the kind of stories that build into legend. The term and many of the collected reports came into popular circulation largely through the work of Loren Coleman and later local chroniclers who treated the triangle as a single zone where the uncanny seemed unusually likely to bloom. But here's where it gets tricky. Being a place of mystery in modern storytelling does not erase the swamp's very real, measured past. Hockomock and its environs are also a strategic landscape in the history of New England. In the 17th century, the swamp's margins were tactical ground during King Philip's War, a violent, devastating conflict across New England in the 1670s where Wampanoag and allied groups resisted colonial encroachment. The swamp's tangled networks of waterways and hummocks offered concealment and refuge. The record of colonial soldiers and of indigenous oral tradition both point to the swamp's role as a theater of human, historical action. Archaeologists and historians have found artifacts and features across the region, from charcoal lenses in the peat that indicate hearths to trade goods in upland camps, that confirm the area was active, lived in, and strategically important long before any modern stories of orbs or cryptids. That layering, everyday life, brutal conflict, ecological continuity, and then modern myth-making, is exactly why the place resists a single explanation. There are practical, evidence-based reasons why people report strange things in the swamp. Optical and geophysical phenomena can be persuasive. Bog gases, methane and phosphine bubbling off decomposing peat, can flare at night or ignite under rare conditions to make will-o'-the-wisp type lights that move across the surface in eerie ways. Temperature inversions, reflected lights from distant roads, and the brain's tendency to pattern match in low visibility conditions contribute too. When your eyes are given little information, the mind supplies narrative. Add to that the power of suggestion. Once an area has a reputation, people expect weirdness, and expectation primes perception. That is the skeptical, scientific toolkit for explaining many of the reports. Yet it is incomplete as an explanation for everything. There exist lodged archaeological facts, oral histories, and persistent topographic oddities, stone alignments, strange depressions, and place names that keep returning the conversation to human meaning-making across centuries. The swamp isn't merely a physics experiment, it is memory made of mud, and memories do not dissolve under chemical analysis alone. Now, let's be fair, the more sensational claims, giant snakes, thunderbirds the size of biplanes, or commonplace Bigfoot sightings, require extraordinary evidence. Most such claims are anecdotal, lacking verifiable physical traces. But folklore scholars and cultural historians will tell you that the content of stories matters even when the empirical support is thin. Talk of giants or monstrous birds is symbolic and can reveal how a community negotiates fear, landscape, and otherness. Thunderbirds and colossal animals appear across indigenous and post-contact North American traditions, and their reappearance in modern reports is partly an inheritance of that mythic vocabulary. In short, whether the story is literal or metaphorical, it tells us something about how people in this landscape frame danger and wonder. When locals say, "The swamp is old," they don't mean just ancient in years. They mean the place remembers in a way our maps do not. That memory shapes the stories people tell about lost children, strange lights, and sudden feelings of being watched. But here's another slice of the mystery. Archaeology in and around Hockomock sometimes pushes against the tidy categories we like to use. Pollen cores show shifts in vegetation that match known episodes of climate fluctuation, and charcoal layers correspond to fire events that could be human-set or natural. In some spots, archaeologists have recovered trade beads and European goods in contexts that complicate assumptions about contact and exchange. Those artifacts suggest dynamic networks of interaction. Indigenous groups were not isolated. They were part of regional exchanges that moved goods, people, and ideas. Still, for all the sherds and corings, many of the conspicuous claims remain unproven. There are holes in the record where an oral history names a burial mound or a battle, but plowed soil, development, or past looting has erased the very layers that might have proved the story. So archaeology is a discipline of both revelation and loss. It illuminates, but it also uncovers gaps in our knowledge. We still don't know how many of those local place names that speak of spirits correspond to discrete, now vanished features, or whether some names instead preserve metaphorical warnings about dangers like treacherous quagmires. Picture yourself now walking a half-hidden trail at dawn, the light wafer-thin and gold. You follow a deer path and then the ground softens. Your boots sink slightly into peat and the sound of distant traffic thins into a different world. Cattails bow along a black channel and the smell is of loam and old rain. You stop and listen. There is a kind of silence here that has teeth, not empty but full of compressed time. Some people describe a pressure on the chest in places like this, a sudden disorientation. Others speak of hearing voices that turn out to be owls or the wind through dead branches. Imagine the first colonists seeing this place at night, with unfamiliar sounds and no clear paths. Or imagine indigenous children learning which hummocks to cross in season. Those embodied practices, the skills of moving through swampy ground, the instincts about which places to avoid, are as much a form of knowledge as any modern field report. Now let's be fair about the modern narrative impulse. When people catalog the Bridgewater Triangle, they collect anomalies into a region-sized dossier. That aggregation is seductive, the idea that if you stitch together several unexplained things on a map, you get a supernatural hot spot. Yet maps are rhetorical devices too. They make associations and sometimes amplify outliers into a pattern. Still, aggregation is not meaningless. Even if each event is mundane, the cluster suggests something about human ecology and memory in the area, perhaps dense wetlands, cottage development, early industrial sites, and a history of displacement combined to produce both more anomalous observations and a cultural appetite to tell those stories. In the same way, certain terrains, coastlines, deserts, swamps, are traditional incubators of liminality and myth, places where the world feels porous, where crossings happen, where thresholds are thin. The Hockomock and its neighbors are that kind of liminal terrain for southeastern Massachusetts. The competing theories then fall into broad camps. 1. Natural and psychological explanations, gases, optics, misidentification and expectation. 2. Social and historical explanations, how colonial violence, displacement, and environmental change shaped stories and left material traces. And 3. Mythic or folkloric readings that see the swamp as a living archive of spirits, warnings, and ancestral presence. None of these is sufficient alone. The swamp asks us to hold them together, to accept the pragmatism of science where it explains observed phenomena, but also to honor the cultural logics that render the swamp meaningful across generations. When we say, we still don't know, we mean more than, we lack data. We mean that the swamp has multiple grammars of sense-making, some built on sediment, some on memory, and that reconciling those grammars is the hard, interesting work. And so we end this stretch of the path with a small reflective thought. Mystery is not just a gap in knowledge, it's also the engine of care. When a community takes a place seriously as mysterious, it pays attention in a way that can protect ecology and memory. Whether that attention leads to careful preservation of wetlands or to sensational tourism that disturbs sensitive sites depends on what narratives become dominant. The swamp thus becomes a mirror. The kind of stories we tell about it reflect who we think we are. Keep walking then, but walk with respect. The swamp remembers more than we do, and in that remembering it keeps secrets we will need to approach slowly. We still don't know exactly which of its stories hold literal truth, and which are moral maps, and perhaps the right answer is both. We still don't know. A ruined chamber lies half swallowed by the forest, its lintel stones sagging like tired brows, and for a moment the place will insist upon two incompatible readings. This is a practical cellar built by colonial farmers, and yet its proportions, alignments, and the clean way night light slips along its inner stones make it read like a deliberate ritual chamber meant to face the stars. Call it the New England Stone Chamber, one-sentence teaser, and already you feel the tug between a modest, terrestrial use and a far more mythic possibility that reaches across oceans and centuries. The dispute around these chambers is not just academic hair-splitting, it is a collision between different historical imaginations and between our hunger for mysterious origins and the sober discipline of archaeology. Some of these structures are straightforward: root cellars, animal pens, foundations for massive colonial chimneys, leftovers of 18th and 19th century farm economies. That is a solid, archaeologically parsable point. Yet there are chambers whose construction, the careful placement of capstones, the orientation of their passages, the presence of long, aligned sight lines across nearby hilltops, offers a visual grammar that people have read as belonging to a very different kind of architectural logic, one that echoes passage tombs and megalithic observatories from parts of Europe. That echo is what launches speculation and sometimes contest. To understand why the debate is so heated, we must put precise dates and cultural frames on the table. The broad sweep of human time in New England is long, Paleo-Indian occupation stretching back more than 10,000 years, followed by archaic adaptations and then woodland cultures whose pottery, seasonal villages, and long-distance trade networks developed over millennia. Colonial settlement begins in the early 1600s and intensifies through the 18th and 19th centuries, bringing European agricultural practices that reshaped the land. Many stone chambers are clearly enmeshed in that colonial agricultural tapestry. Radiocarbon dating work done on organic materials in and near some chambers has yielded ages that place human activity in the 15th to 17th centuries in certain cases, contemporaneous with late pre-contact or early contact phases, while other chambers show material signatures that fit comfortably within the colonial period. That dating complexity matters because it tells us that some of these structures were built and rebuilt across centuries, and that layering makes a tidy single-origin explanation unlikely. Key discoveries around these chambers and the nearby mounds complicate the story further. Excavations at certain coastal and inland sites have produced pottery sherds that match woodland types, chipped stone tools that belong to archaic or Paleo-Indian technologies, and, in some coastal contexts, shell middens that speak to intensive marine foraging. On the Cape and the outer islands, systematic archaeological surveys have documented thousands of sites spanning the Holocene and have shown that prehistoric peoples repeatedly returned to particular headlands and estuaries to harvest fish and shellfish. In proximity to some stone chambers, archaeologists have found hearths, food residues, and trade beads or European goods in mixed contexts, evidence of a landscape used continuously and in changing ways from pre-contact to the colonial centuries. Those finds are not an argument for transatlantic contact. Rather, they tell a story of long-term use and episodic reuse of built features. The cumulative effect of these discoveries is to make the chambers feel less like isolated curiosities and more like nodes in a dense human geography. Now, let's be fair, the more romantic narrative, that these chambers are the footprints of transatlantic voyagers, ancient European mariners, or a remnant of a lost, sophisticated stone-building tradition native to New England, is alluring because it simplifies mystery into a single glorious answer. It gives us grand continuity with familiar old-world monuments, and lets us imagine ancient voyagers arriving, settling briefly, and leaving architectural echoes. That theory, compelling in the mind's eye, has tended to flourish outside mainstream archaeology where persuasive, physical proof is required, stratified dates, clear associational artifacts, and contextual settlement patterns. The mainstream archaeological view, tempered by fieldwork and radiocarbon evidence, tends toward a plural explanation. Some chambers are vernacular colonial features, some are the reuse of pre-existing stone placements originally made by indigenous peoples for hunting, trapping, or ceremonial use, and a few retain alignments or features peculiar enough to warrant focused investigation. The truth is probably a patchwork. Among the competing theories, three stand out. The conventional and widely accepted theory is practical colonial origin. Farmers clearing glacial erratics piled them into walls and sometimes created small stone chambers as root cellars and animal shelters. The second theory, embraced by some antiquarian and alternative history circles, posits that certain chambers replicate Old World megalithic forms, a suggestion that, if true, would point to pre-Columbian contact of sufficient technical depth to produce architectural echoes. The third, a view that has gained traction in some circles, interprets select chambers as indigenous spiritual places, analogues to kivas or ritual houses, integrated into a native cosmology with stellar alignments and seasonal uses. Each of these theories takes different pieces of the physical evidence seriously, and ignores others. None resolves everything cleanly. The chamber's variety means they can simultaneously be utilitarian constructions, sacred sites, and later reused foundations. That palimpsest quality is precisely what tempts imaginative leaps and equally demands careful, contextual work. Think of one specific coastal site where an enigmatic stone structure stands a short walk from a cliff edge. The stones are heavy, the passage leading in from the southwest aligns, on certain nights, to the setting of the summer sun behind a distant promontory. Inside, small niches could be read as storage for ritual implements, or merely as convenient places to prop a lantern. Nearby, archaeologists have found pottery fragments dated to the woodland period and, in the overlying layers, shards of European-made ceramics. The stratigraphy suggests a long durée of use, breaking and reusing the same built features across time. That same stratigraphic complexity is the source of both wonder and caution. The pre-contact sherds do not suddenly prove a prehistoric chamber. They prove people were in the landscape long before later stonework was made or modified. To proclaim a single origin would be to flatten centuries into a single gesture. Still, the alignment and the atmosphere prime the imagination. Picture yourself slipping down that southwest-facing passage at dusk as the sun bleeds gold behind the headland. The stone is cool, the air smells of salt and peat, and you feel somewhere between a colonial farmer fetching roots and a person in a very old nighttime ceremony. That sensory juxtaposition is how stonework creates its own demand for explanation. There is a much darker set of stories that have long shadowed discussion of mounds and buried remains in New England, tales of giant skeletons unearthed in the 19th century, photographs and newspaper stories that insist there were human skeletons of monstrous proportions, and the odd, persistent rumor that museums and universities quietly removed evidence to avoid upsetting established narratives. These stories flare up on the internet and in sensational programming, but they have been thoroughly investigated and mostly debunked by scholars and fact-checkers. The history of such claims is instructive in itself. In 19th century America, before modern archaeological standards, sensational displays of giant skeletons, most famously the fabricated Cardiff giant hoax, were a spectacle and also a way of asserting narratives of conquest and exceptionalism. Modern investigations show no reliable, verifiable documentation that scientifically confirms the existence of a race of ancient giants buried across the Northeast. Instead, misinterpretations, hoaxes, and a few pathological growth cases and skeletal remains have created a scattered archive of stories that are part myth and part social drama. We should neither ignore the stories. They tell us about who made them and why, nor treat them as literal history without corroborating evidence. Still, for all the debunking, there remains an important kernel of truth behind the persistent, giant narratives. European American settlers sometimes misinterpreted indigenous burial mounds and monumental earthworks they encountered. The scale of some mounds and of certain ceremonial earthworks in other parts of North America can astonish a person not versed in indigenous architectural traditions, and in the absence of long conversations and respectful inquiry, settlers sometimes filled those gaps with fantasies. That failure of understanding was then narrated into narratives of lost races or vanished giants, a rhetorical move that erased indigenous achievement by reassigning it to mythical, others, or to vanished peoples. In other words, the giant story is itself evidence of cultural dislocation, of 19th century myth-making, and of the politics of who gets credit for monumental labor. The more honest and productive historical move is to acknowledge indigenous authorship where appropriate, and to treat the scale and care of earthworks as human achievement rather than as proof of mythical races. There are coastal sites that add another layer, artifacts that suggest long-distance exchange networks, and the mobility of people. On the Cape and Islands, native groups maintain finely tuned seasonal cycles of fishing, shellfishing, and coastal foraging. Those cycles produce dense middens, shells and fish remains compacted over generations, which archaeologists can date and analyze for diet, trade, and seasonality. At a few remarkable sites, archaeologists have found exotic materials, non-local stone types, marine shells fashioned into beads that bear chemical signatures of distant waters, suggesting networks that reached up and down the Atlantic seaboard. Those trade routes were not the grand transoceanic voyages of some alternative histories. They were the lifeblood of regional exchange, allowing communities to circulate tools, foodstuffs, and ideas across remarkable distances for people whose boats could hug coasts and cross short open water stretches. Those patterns invite us to imagine seafaring expertise among indigenous peoples that was often underestimated by early chroniclers. The sea was not an expanse of emptiness, but a highway of highly local expertise and seasonal knowledge. Now, let's be fair about the sources that push the Old World megalith hypothesis. Some researchers and independent scholars have catalogued alignments and similarities to European structures, pointing to capstones and corbelling that look visually familiar to visitors from the Atlantic archipelagos. They sometimes present stellar alignments taken from a handful of chambers where capstones line up with solstices or where sightlines mark particular lunar events. These observations, if accurate, are suggestive and require investigation. But celestial alignments can also be fragile data. Points of sight can be created or destroyed by later landscape change, trees can obscure lines, and coincidence can produce impressive-looking patterns. Moreover, a match in appearance is not a proof of cultural descent. Convergent solutions to common engineering problems can and do arise independently. The most responsible path is targeted excavation, careful stratigraphy, and replication of astronomical observations rather than leaping to transatlantic conclusions. That is how science narrows possibilities. Picture yourself now standing inside one of the longer chambers on a late autumn night. A wind stirs the pines outside and a sliver of moon slides along the inner wall. If you are inclined toward the grand narrative, you might feel the chamber hum with old-world echoes and imagine flint napping hands beside a sealed ritual hearth. If you are inclined to the more parsimonious explanation, you might think of a family storing root crops or a group sheltering sheep. Both imaginings are human and revealing. The point is not to eliminate wonder, it is to channel it in ways that respect both evidence and imagination. The chamber's material presence invites both a sterile survey and a mythic retelling, inviting us into a double relationship with the past in which science and story are not enemies but different forms of attention. Another set of unresolved questions clusters around mounds and burial sites in Massachusetts that actually do exist and have been carefully studied. Their treatments illuminate social complexity and raise ethical histories about excavation and collection. Indigenous burial practices vary widely across time and space. Some included bundle burials, some mound interments, and some used natural rock shelters or caves. Where archaeologists have excavated respectfully and in consultation with descendant communities, burials have yielded rich data about diet, disease, genetic affiliation, and social differentiation. Where excavations were careless or extractive, as in many 19th century digs, the material record has been damaged or lost, and the ethical damage was greater still. Those histories compel us to read archaeological evidence alongside indigenous knowledge and to prioritize repatriation and collaboration. The mound's meaning is not a puzzle to be solved independent of their living descendants. They are part of ongoing cultural landscapes. So what are the competing theories about these stone and mound phenomena, ultimately? Put simply, they divide into 1. Pragmatic colonial vernacular constructions, 2. Indigenous built features integrated into a deep native landscape, sometimes reused in later periods, and 3. Speculative Old World against New World explanations that require stronger, stratified proof. Each has its evidentiary champions and detractors. The simplest synthesis is that the cultural terrain of Massachusetts, glacial stones, coastal prominence, and a long human history of seasonal occupation, produced many kinds of stone placements that were then interpreted differently over time. In that synthesis, the chambers are not a single problem but a category of human activity, clearing fields, marking places, sheltering goods and animals, and occasionally building spaces with symbolic alignments. Conflicts arise when one explanatory frame tries to elbow out the others. Good archaeology resists that by keeping context central. Yet the itch of romance, the desire for a single, elegant, transoceanic revelation, is potent and will not die simply because it lacks proof. And there is a final, human point to hold. Our narratives about these features often reflect more about ourselves than about the stones. When a community asserts that chambers are colonial root cellars, the claim can be a way of grounding identity in familiar settler history. When another community asserts indigenous primacy, the claim can be an act of reclaiming visible heritage. When someone else proclaims Old World visitors, that claim can be a yearning for ancient continuity with familiar Old World traditions. These interpretive moves are political and effective. They shape stewardship priorities, conservation, tourism, and the very dignity of descendant communities. Archaeology is not an ivory tower activity divorced from these stakes. It sits in the middle of contentious human stories about belonging, credit, and memory. That is why the most productive path is collaborative archaeology that listens to descendant voices and that uses science to answer limited, precise questions rather than to proclaim sweeping origins unsupported by data. Finally, let us not forget the mythic breath that hangs over these places. The possibility of lost tribes, ancient voyagers and giants is intoxicating because it taps a deep vein of human storytelling, the part that wants to believe extraordinary things lie just beyond a hill or at the edge of the tide. Those stories are not neutral, they have histories and consequences. The giant narrative, for instance, when taken at face value and without scrutiny, can erase indigenous accomplishments and reassign them to mythic others. Yet even while guarding against such erasures, we should not sterilize wonder. Imagine again, this time on a clear winter morning, walking across a field where a lone mound catches the sunlight, and feeling the long arc of human time pressing at your ankles. Imagine the sound of a distant gull, the flash of a flint blade in sun, a child's laughter across centuries. These are aesthetic experiences that feed a communal sense of continuity. The challenge is to let them exist without letting them override the evidence, or the rights of the living descendants. We still don't know, with complete certainty, which of the chambers were originally colonial root cellars and which, if any, were deliberately constructed long before European contact as observatories or ritual spaces. We still don't know the full scope of the coastal trade networks because erosion and centuries of sea level change have claimed sites we would like to test. We still don't know the stories that were lost when 19th century collectors took materials without context, and we still don't know whether any of the more extraordinary hypotheses about Old World architectural influence can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The truth is quilted and layered. The stones refuse a single tidy answer. But that is precisely the point. In the refusal lies invitation. Picture the chamber one more time, the cool stone beneath your palms, the sky opening above, the long thread of human hands that touch those stones for reasons practical, sacred, or otherwise. And let the uncertainty be not a failure but an invitation to care, to dig carefully, and to listen. We still don't know. You have walked with me through rocks that speak in layers, through a swamp that keeps its own counsel, and into stone chambers that refuse a single origin story. Now let us stitch those threads together and ask what the insistence of mystery teaches us about who we are and what we owe the past. If the narrative so far felt like moving between a laboratory and a fireside, that was intentional. Science gives us a disciplined way to ask questions and to test claims, while story gives us the courage to imagine possibilities where data are thin. Both practices are necessary. The final accounting here is not meant to collapse wonder into caution or to flatten reverie into footnotes. It is meant to show how wonder and rigor can live in productive tension. When you hold that tension, you get the best of both, a sense of awe that prompts careful investigation, and a methodical curiosity that refuses to stomp on sacred stories. We end, therefore, not with tidy answers but with a richer relationship to doubt, doubt as invitation rather than defeat. At the center of all these New England mysteries is a shared human pattern. Places that are sustained in memory and ritual tend to accumulate layers of use, reuse, and meaning. A boulder at a river mouth does not arrive as a single message. It is repeatedly recruited into new narratives across generations. A swamp is not merely a void between settlements, but a living library that records vegetation changes, hearths, and human fear. Stone chambers are not always monuments manufactured by a single culture but are often palimpsests where clearing fields, storing crops, marking graves, and performing ceremony all meet. That palimpsest view honors both the archaeologist's stratigraphy and the storyteller's sense that objects hold countless lives inside them. It also exposes a moral responsibility. When we excavate, interpret, or popularize, we must remember that these are not inert curiosities. They are parts of ongoing landscapes for descendant communities, for wildlife, and for the places themselves. The evidence across Massachusetts, from etched boulders to peat-preserved pollen, from shell middens to the geometry of a corbelled ceiling, points toward continuity and complexity. Indigenous peoples were not marginal players on a blank shore. They were the architects of long seasonal systems, creators of exchange networks, seafarers with local mastery, and storytellers whose cosmologies encoded warnings, harvest calendars, and sacred geographies. Colonial arrivals disrupted those systems in violent and many-layered ways, often misreading or devaluing the indigenous technologies and meanings they found. Later antiquarian impulses, sometimes curious and sometimes opportunistic, layered myth and misinterpretation on top of real, contextual evidence. So the archaeological record in this region is not merely a list of artifacts but a conversation across time, one that demands humility from any interpreter. To read better is to listen to that plurality of voices and to use scientific tools as a way to translate rather than to overwrite. There is another, quieter lesson in these mysteries. Place names and oral histories are not folklore to be shelved, they are data. The Algonquian names that cluster around Hockomock speak in metaphor and instruction. They mark danger, memory, and ritual. Oral traditions, stories told by elders and passed between families, often contain kernels of information about landscape change, migrations, and historical events that can align in surprising ways with paleo-environmental data. When legends and cores agree about a major flood or when a place name warns of quicksand where cores indicate unstable peat, we have a richer, multimodal archive that blends qualitative and quantitative knowledge. Scientists who collaborate with communities and who respect non-academic forms of knowledge often find that mysteries yield more inviting answers than when scholarship arrogates sole proprietorship over the past. And yet there is the persistent, human hunger for single grand narrative answers, pre-Columbian transoceanic contacts that would rewrite textbooks, lost tribes whose sophistication mirrors old world monuments, giants that solve for scale in a single stroke. These narratives are emotionally powerful because they supply coherence and spectacle. They also have a troubling history. When the attribution of monumental work is shifted from indigenous labor to mythical outsiders, it erases real human achievement and helps justify dispossession. The careful scholar must therefore resist the seduction of neatness and instead accept plurality. When a claim is made, that a boulder bears Phoenician script or that a chamber echoes Irish passage tombs, the responsible response is to examine stratigraphy, seek independent corroboration, and consider archaeological context rather than to announce a paradigm shift on the basis of resemblance alone. Similar forms can arise independently. Human beings solve practical problems in convergent ways. That does not make imagination wrong, but it does make evidentiary rigor indispensable. Yet let us not mistake caution for coldness. The lure of myth is not a rival that must be abolished. It is a human impulse that, handled with care, can deepen appreciation and stewardship. Myth gives the stones voices and the swamp a personality. It brings listeners to sites who might otherwise never look twice at a lone mound. The trick is to channel myth productively. Let it invite people to the landscape, then teach them how to observe without trampling, how to listen without inventing, and how to combine story with method. Institutions, museums, and content creators have a duty to present mysteries as invitations to inquiry rather than as clickbait that flattens nuance. When public narratives celebrate wonder and humility together, they create allies for preservation, people who will stand up for wetlands, support repatriation, and fund careful excavation that honors living communities. There is also an ethical dimension to how we engage with the past. When bones are disturbed, when artifacts are removed without context, when ancestral places are commercialized, there is real harm done to descendants, to the web of life, and to the integrity of the record. Contemporary ethics in archaeology emphasizes consultation, repatriation, and shared stewardship. That is not sentimentalism. It is a practical framework for ensuring that when we seek answers we are not doing so at the cost of human dignity. In Massachusetts and elsewhere, agreements to return human remains, to co-design research with indigenous nations, and to invest in local capacity for heritage management are signals that the future of these mysteries can be just as moral as it is curious. Another theme cannot be avoided: geography matters. The New England coastline, with its sheltered estuaries, islands, and short open water crossings, supported a maritime expertise among indigenous peoples that European chroniclers often underestimated. The sea was a connective tissue, not an empty boundary. Small boats, seasonal voyaging, and localized trade routes knit together distant communities, a fact visible in the chemical signatures of shells and in the movement of exotic lithic materials. Inland, glacial erratics and stone-strewn fields shaped agricultural practices and, unintentionally, the fabric of later stone constructions. Wetlands preserved evidence that upland plowing destroyed elsewhere. Understanding how human ecology and environment co-evolved is essential to making sense of why certain anomalies appear where they do. As we close this conversation, I want you to picture again the scenes we visited with fresh eyes. Stand at the riverbank in early morning. The boulder is damp with tide, the carvings like a shorthand left for travelers across centuries. Move to the edge of the swamp at dusk and smell peat and decaying leaves. Hear how the place alters your perception and how its stories both warn and invite. Enter the ruined chamber as twilight thins and feel the cool stone under your palm. Notice how practical and sacred uses can coexist in one place. These are not theatrical props for a single explanation. They are human places that have accrued meaning in layers. Our job is to treat them with curiosity, rigor, and respect. What should you take away after walking this strange, wonderful landscape of mystery? First, cherish uncertainty as a productive state. Mystery is not the enemy of knowledge, it is its fuel. Second, Value multiple ways of knowing: scientific, oral, ritual, artistic, and seek to put them in conversation rather than in competition. Third, prioritize ethical stewardship over sensationalism. Sites are not content buckets for instant virality. They are connections to living peoples and fragile ecologies. Fourth, realize that the impulse to explain grandly should prompt us to ask for better evidence, not to punish imagination. Let storytelling draw people close, then let careful scholarship, done with consent and respect, answer what it can. Finally, remember that these mysteries are not mere puzzles to be solved by the triumphant publication of a single paper. They are invitations to stewardship, to humility, to ongoing curiosity. In the spaces where the evidence is stubbornly thin, let that thinness be a reason to protect and learn rather than to declare victory. The landscape will keep giving up secrets at its own pace. Sometimes a charcoal lens will speak of a fire event. Sometimes an oral history will align with ecological data. Sometimes the only lesson we get is the deepening of wonder. The better we become at listening in multiple registers, the more the past will reciprocate. Picture yourself one last time, stepping away from the stones and the swamp with the light shifting and the world opening like a book whose pages smell of salt and peat. You carry with you a small set of practices. Look carefully, demand evidence, honor stories, and protect places. These are modest commitments, but their powers are cumulative. Across the long arc of human time, small acts of attention have saved wetlands, preserved oral traditions, and nudged science toward better questions. The mysteries of Massachusetts will not be exhausted by a single explanation, and they should not be. They are better as enduring invitations that call us back, again and again, to listen and to care. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.